Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. It was supposed to be a joke, a silly late-night game fueled by boredom and a few too many beers. If I'd known what dialing that number would lead to, I never would have picked up my phone that night. But there I was, laughing along with my friends, completely oblivious to the nightmare that was about to unfold. It started like this. 4 of us were hanging out at Ryan's apartment, killing time and tossing around urban legends. You know the kind. Ghosts in mirrors, haunted hotels, cursed objects. We were deep into it when Ryan pulled up a website on his phone. "Hey, have you guys heard of the cursed phone number?" he asked, a mischievous glint in his eye. "You know, the one you're never supposed to dial?" I chuckled. "Come on, Ryan, seriously?" "No, I'm serious," he insisted, scrolling through the page. "Apparently, if you dial it, weird stuff happens. People have reported all kinds of crazy things. Getting strange calls afterward, seeing things, nightmares that never end. It's like Bloody Mary, but for phones." "That's dumb," Mark chimed in, shaking his head. "There's no way a phone number could be cursed. It's just a bunch of digits." Ryan shrugged. "Maybe. But people swear it's real. They say once you call it, you can't escape whatever's on the other end." "What's the number?" I asked, half joking, half curious. Ryan grinned and held up his phone. 6660133. Creepy, right? I rolled my eyes but couldn't help feeling a tiny spark of apprehension. Urban legends were fun and all, but deep down part of me had always been fascinated by the paranormal. Not that I believed in it, of course not, but there was something unsettling about the idea of a phone number being connected to something unnatural. "All right, let's do it," I said, pulling out my phone. I typed in the number, my thumb hovering over the call button. The others watched, grinning, waiting for me to make the move. "You won't do it," Mark teased. Without thinking, I hit dial. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then, the line connected. But there was no voice on the other end, just a deep, buzzing static. For a moment, I thought it was a bad connection, or maybe some old prank line. But then, beneath the static, I heard something faint. It was a voice, distorted and low, whispering words I couldn't understand. The sound made my skin crawl. "Hello?" I said, my voice cracking slightly. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, suddenly, a sharp, high-pitched scream erupted from the speaker. It was so loud and sudden that I dropped the phone in shock, my heart racing. "What the hell was that?" Ryan asked, his face pale. I stared at my phone on the floor. The screen was still lit, the call ongoing. I reached down with shaking hands and pressed the end call button. The screaming stopped. "Dude, that was messed up," Mark said, his grin now gone. "That was probably just a prank line, right?" I shrugged, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. "Yeah, probably." But something about that call didn't feel right. That night, I tried to brush it off. I went home, turned on the TV, and settled into bed, determined to forget the whole thing. But as I lay there in the dark, my mind kept going back to that scream. It wasn't just a random noise. It had felt personal, like it was meant for me. I finally drifted off to sleep sometime after midnight, but it wasn't restful. My dreams were filled with disjointed images, shadowy figures, empty streets, and that same static buzzing in my ears. The worst part, though, was the voice. That same faint whisper I'd heard on the phone echoed through my dreams, but this time I could make out the words. "I'm coming." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light coming from my phone on the nightstand. As I reached for it to check the time, the screen lit up with a new notification. One new voicemail. Confused, I unlocked my phone. I hadn't heard it ring. I didn't recognize the number either. It was all zeros, just a string of them. With a growing sense of dread, I tapped the voicemail and brought the phone to my ear. At first, there was only static again. But then, the whisper returned. "Why did you call?" My blood ran cold. I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. This wasn't a prank. It couldn't be. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to shake it off as some kind of bizarre coincidence, but the uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I decided not to mention the voicemail to my friends. They'd just laugh it off, tell me I was overreacting. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. Over the next few days, I started receiving more voicemails, always from the same number, always filled with that same static and whispering. Each time, the voice grew clearer, more insistent. "I'm getting closer." I couldn't block the number. Every time I tried, my phone would glitch, the screen freezing or the call log disappearing. I even considered changing my number, but something told me it wouldn't make a difference. Whatever was happening, it wasn't something I could outrun that easily. The worst part, though, was the nightmares. Every night, the dreams grew darker, more vivid. I'd wake up gasping for air, my sheets soaked in sweat. I'd see the same figure, tall, shadowy, featureless, standing at the edge of my bed, watching me. And always, that voice. "I'm here." One night, about a week after the first call, I woke up to find my phone vibrating on the nightstand. The screen was lit up with an incoming call. The number was all zeros again. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the screen, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to answer it, to confront whatever was happening head on. But another part of me, the rational part, screamed at me to throw the phone out the window and never look back. Against my better judgment, I answered. I didn't speak. I just held the phone to my ear, waiting. At first there was nothing but static again, but then the voice came through, clearer than ever before. "I'm outside." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned to look at the window beside my bed. The curtains were drawn, but through the thin fabric, I could see the faint outline of something or someone standing just beyond the glass. I dropped the phone, scrambling out of bed and backing away from the window. My heart raced as I stared, half expecting the figure to burst through the glass at any moment. But it didn't move. It just stood there watching. The phone vibrated again, the screen lighting up with another call. My hands shook as I picked it up, the same number flashing on the screen. I answered, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" There was a pause. Then, the voice responded, low and menacing. "You called me. Now it's my turn." The line went dead. I didn't sleep at all that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing outside. Its faceless silhouette burned into my mind. By morning, I was a wreck, pale, exhausted, and desperate for answers. I decided to confront Ryan. Maybe he knew something more about the cursed number, something he hadn't told us that night. I needed to know what I was dealing with. But when I called Ryan, his phone went straight to voicemail. I tried Mark next, but the same thing happened. Panic set in as I realized neither of my friends had been in touch since the night we dialed that number. I drove to Ryan's apartment, my hands shaking the entire way. When I arrived, the building was eerily quiet. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. I banged on it harder, shouting his name. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but as I leaned closer to the door, it hit me like a punch to the gut. Something rotten, foul, and unmistakably wrong. I stumbled back, my stomach churning. I called the police. They arrived within minutes and broke down the door. What they found inside will haunt me for the rest of my life. Ryan was dead, his body slumped against the wall, his eyes wide open in terror. But it wasn't just the way he looked. It was the writing, scrawled across the walls in what looked like blood. I warned you. I don't know how I got home after that. Everything was a blur of flashing lights and panicked questions. All I knew was that Ryan was gone, and I was next. I could feel it. That night, I didn't bother going to bed. I sat in the middle of my living room, every light in the house turned on, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. The calls kept coming, each one more insistent than the last. I stopped answering them, but the messages still played in my head. I'm coming for you. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. The nightmares are getting worse, and the figure outside my window is closer every night. I made a mistake that night when I dialed that number. A mistake I'll never be able to undo. And now, I'm just waiting for the inevitable. I never believed in haunted houses, not until I found myself standing in front of one on a cold October evening. The towering structure loomed over me like a relic of a forgotten time, its windows dark and lifeless, its once grand facade now marred by decay and neglect. The city had grown around it, swallowing this old mansion in its shadow, leaving it to rot amidst the hustle and bustle of modern life. Most people didn't even notice it was there, buried in a quiet corner between towering skyscrapers. But I noticed, and I shouldn't have. It all started with a dare. Isn't that how these things always begin? I bet you won't last a night in there, Ben, Mark had said, his grin wide and mocking. It's just an old house. Yeah, probably full of rats and mold, I'd replied, my own bravado masking the flicker of hesitation inside me. Fine, I'll do it. It wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about proving it to myself. I wasn't afraid of some crumbling building, and I wasn't about to let my friends think I was. The mansion sat at the end of a forgotten street, hidden behind a tall iron gate that creaked ominously as I pushed it open. The overgrown garden, tangled with weeds, clawed at my legs as I made my way to the front door. The mansion itself was an imposing sight, with ivy clinging to the cracked walls and boarded-up windows that rattled with the wind. The door was unlocked, had been for years apparently. No one dared to fix it up, not with all the rumors swirling around the place. I stepped inside, the smell of damp wood and dust hitting me immediately. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if the house itself had been holding its breath for years. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows along the hallway, which was lined with faded portraits of people long dead. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I walked deeper into the house. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that wraps itself around you and makes you hyper-aware of every breath, every step. I could hear the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet, but nothing else. No city sounds, no cars honking in the distance, no voices. It was as if I had stepped into another world, one where time had stopped and nothing existed beyond these walls. I made my way into what had once been the living room, where tattered curtains hung from the windows and broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. A grand fireplace dominated the room, its hearth cold and empty. Above it hung a massive portrait of a woman in a long flowing gown, her eyes dark and piercing. I stared at the portrait for a moment, feeling a strange chill run down my spine. There was something about the woman's face that unsettled me, something too lifelike in her expression. It was as if she were watching me. No, not as if. She was watching me. I shook my head, dismissing the thought as ridiculous. It was just a painting, just an old house. I set up my sleeping bag in the corner of the room and settled in for what I assumed would be an uneventful night. But then, the noises started. At first it was subtle, a faint tapping, like fingernails lightly drumming against wood. I ignored it, chalking it up to the wind or the house settling. But then it grew louder, more deliberate. A steady knock, knock, knock coming from the hallway. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest, and shone my flashlight toward the door. The hallway was empty, but the knocking continued, rhythmic and insistent. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just the house playing tricks on me. After all, old buildings made weird noises, right? But then came the footsteps. Slow, measured, deliberate. They echoed down the hallway, getting closer with each step. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the open doorway, waiting, watching. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and for a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then the door slammed shut. I scrambled to my feet, flashlight trembling in my hand as I backed away. My mind raced with explanations, but none of them made sense. The door had been wide open just moments ago, and now it was closed, as if someone or something had forced it shut. My heart raced as I tried to steady my breathing. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself. "Just an old house, just the wind." But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Suddenly, the fireplace roared to life, flames crackling and casting flickering shadows across the room. I hadn't touched it. No one had. And yet, there it was, burning, alive. Panic surged through me, and I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked at the handle, pulling with all my strength, but it was as if the door had been sealed shut by an invisible force. My flashlight flickered, and I felt the temperature in the room drop, a bone-chilling cold that sank into my skin. Then I heard it. A whisper. Low and breathy, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight swinging wildly across the room. The portrait of the woman, she was no longer staring ahead. Her eyes had shifted, following me. Her once neutral expression had twisted into a cruel smile. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick, some kind of elaborate prank. But there was no one here. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices now, all around me, echoing through the house. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Angry, accusing, vengeful. My flashlight flickered again, and in the brief moments of darkness, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. No, a figure standing in the doorway. It was the woman from the portrait. She was no longer confined to the canvas. She stood there, pale and ghostly, her eyes locked onto mine. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to hear them. I could feel her intent, cold and malevolent. I backed away, my hands shaking, but there was nowhere to go. The door was still locked, and the windows were boarded up tight. I was trapped. She took a step toward me, and the flames in the fireplace roared higher, casting eerie shadows across her figure. I could see her more clearly now. Her gown tattered and worn, her face twisted into a mask of rage. And those eyes, those dark, empty eyes bore into me, filled with a hatred I couldn't comprehend. I screamed, banging on the door, desperate to escape. But the house wouldn't let me go. It had claimed me, just as it had claimed all the others before me. I could feel it now, the weight of the souls trapped here, the anger, the sorrow. They were all around me, whispering, watching, waiting. The last thing I remember before everything went black was her face, inches from mine, her cold breath on my skin as she whispered, "You're never leaving." I don't know how I got out. I woke up the next morning on the street outside the mansion, the door wide open behind me. My friends found me hours later, shivering and incoherent, mumbling about the woman in the portrait. They laughed it off, convinced I'd just scared myself silly. But I know the truth. That house is haunted. And it's not just haunted, it's hungry. I wasn't the first to walk through those doors, and I won't be the last. But I got lucky. Next time, whoever enters that mansion might not be so fortunate. And if you're ever wandering through the city and come across an old, forgotten mansion tucked away between the buildings, do yourself a favor. Keep walking. I never believed in anything supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, and curses all seemed like stories told to scare kids. At least that's what I used to think, until I took the night shift at a department store. Now, I'm not so sure. The mannequins, the lifeless plastic figures that filled the store, aren't as harmless as I once thought. It started as a regular part-time gig to make some extra cash. I had just moved into the city, living paycheck to paycheck in a cramped apartment. When I saw an ad for an overnight security job at a high-end department store downtown, I figured, why not? Easy money, no heavy lifting, just watching security cameras for a few hours. It was too good to pass up. The store, Harper and Finch, was old, one of those big fancy places that sold overpriced clothes no one needed. During the day, it bustled with shoppers, but at night, it became eerily still. There was something unsettling about walking through empty aisles lined with mannequins wearing the latest designer clothes. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the silence playing tricks on my mind. My first few shifts were uneventful. I'd spend hours staring at the security monitors, occasionally walking the floor to check on things. The mannequins never bothered me, though I couldn't help but feel like they were watching me as I passed. I chalked it up to paranoia. After all, they were just plastic, right? But one night, something changed. I arrived for my shift like usual, but there was an odd tension in the air. I couldn't explain it, but everything felt off. I brushed it aside and got to work. Midnight came and went, and the store was as quiet as always. I was sipping a cup of cold coffee, watching the flickering camera feeds, when I noticed something strange on one of the monitors. A mannequin in the women's section was out of place. It had been standing by the window display earlier, but now it was at the end of the aisle, facing the camera. I paused the feed, rewound it. Nothing. The mannequin didn't move, at least not that I could see. I rubbed my eyes, chalking it up to exhaustion. Maybe someone had forgotten to put it back after moving it around. It was an old store. Maybe things got shifted. I made a note to check it out during my next round. An hour later, I grabbed my flashlight and started my usual patrol. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the glossy floor. The mannequins stood silently in their designated spots, frozen in their stiff, elegant poses. When I reached the women's section, I stopped cold. The mannequin that had been at the end of the aisle was gone. I spun around, shining my light down every row, but it was nowhere to be seen. My pulse quickened as I moved further into the section. Then, just as I turned a corner, there it was, standing in the middle of the floor, facing me. I laughed nervously. "Someone must be messing with me," I muttered under my breath. I cautiously approached the figure. It was just as I remembered. Tall, plastic, dressed in a sleek red dress. I reached out and touched its arm. Cold, unmoving. I pushed it slightly and it wobbled on its stand but didn't fall over. Just a mannequin. But as I turned to leave, I heard a faint scrape behind me. I whipped around, my heart pounding. The mannequin had shifted, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. Its head, which had been tilted upward, was now angled down, as if it were looking at me. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. "This is insane," I whispered, backing away slowly. "It's just my imagination." But then, I heard it again. Scrape. This time it was louder, more deliberate. The mannequins around me seemed to hum with energy, as if they were all watching, waiting. I backed away faster, my breaths shallow and rapid. Suddenly the lights flickered, plunging the store into near darkness. My flashlight beam shook as I swept it across the room. The mannequins seemed closer now, though I hadn't heard them move. Their blank faces, devoid of any features, felt more menacing in the dark. I took another step back and bumped into something solid. I spun around, expecting to see a wall, but instead, I was face to face with another mannequin. Its hand was outstretched, almost as if it was reaching for me. I jumped back, My scream caught in my throat. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. "This isn't funny." No answer. Just the echo of my voice in the cavernous store. I ran for the security office, not bothering to look back. My hands shook as I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me. I collapsed into the chair, staring at the monitors. My heart raced, and sweat dripped down my forehead. That's when I saw it. The mannequins, every single one of them, had moved. They were no longer standing in their neat rows. They were scattered across the floor, some in twisted, unnatural poses. One had its arm raised as if waving. Another was crouched low to the ground, as if ready to pounce. And then, one by one, they began to move. I watched in horror as they shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly. They weren't walking. No, it was more like they were gliding across the floor. But it wasn't the smooth, graceful movement you'd expect from something supernatural. It was jagged, jerky, like they were struggling to control their stiff bodies. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. One of them, the mannequin in the red dress, was making its way toward the security office. Its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and its arms were raised, reaching for the door. I scrambled out of my chair and looked around the room for something, anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a heavy metal flashlight. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I gripped it tightly and braced myself as the door rattled. The mannequin was outside. I could hear its plastic fingers scraping against the wood, trying to get in. "No," I muttered, backing away. "This isn't happening. This can't be real." But it was. The doorknob twisted, and before I could react, the door swung open. The mannequin stood there, motionless, but I knew it was aware of me. Its blank face seemed to twist into a mocking grin, though there were no lips to smile. I swung the flashlight with all my strength, hitting it square in the chest. The mannequin staggered, but didn't fall. I swung again, harder this time, and its head snapped to the side with a sickening crack. But still, it kept coming. I backed into the corner of the room, my heart hammering in my chest. There was nowhere left to run. The mannequin reached for me, its cold fingers brushing against my arm. I screamed and swung the flashlight one last time, connecting with its head. The plastic shattered, and the mannequin crumpled to the floor. For a moment, I thought it was over. I thought I had won. But then, the lights flickered again, and the other mannequins began to move. I could see them on the security monitors, coming from every corner of the store, their stiff limbs jerking as they made their way toward the office. I was out of time. I bolted out of the office, racing through the darkened aisles, dodging mannequins as they closed in around me. Their footsteps echoed in the empty store, faster now, more determined. I didn't dare look back. I reached the exit and threw myself against the door, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked at the handle, pounding on the glass, but it was no use. I was trapped, and then I heard it. The sound of plastic scraping against the floor, coming closer and closer. The mannequins had caught up. I turned to face them, my back pressed against the door. They were all around me now, their featureless faces staring, their arms outstretched. And in that moment, I knew I would never make it out of that store alive. I always loved camping. Something about the fresh air, the crackling of the campfire, and the escape from the hustle of everyday life felt freeing. I'd been camping dozens of times, and the woods had always been my refuge, a place of peace. But after that night, everything changed. The forest, once a sanctuary, became a nightmare. It started with a group of friends, Ryan, Emily, David, and me. We had planned a weekend camping trip at a remote site in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Ryan had heard about the spot from an old coworker who said it was far from any official campgrounds, nestled deep in the woods where few people ever went. We liked the sound of it, quiet, secluded, and perfect for a weekend escape. We packed our gear, loaded up David's old SUV, and set out early Friday morning. The drive was long, but we were excited, chatting about everything from ghost stories to work drama. None of us had any idea how real those ghost stories would become. As we drove deeper into the forest, the paved road turned to dirt, and eventually, we were on a narrow, winding path surrounded by towering trees. Ryan had the GPS coordinates, and after another hour, we reached the spot. It was perfect, a clearing with a view of the distant mountains, and no one else in sight. We set up camp quickly, pitching our tents and gathering wood for the fire. The sun was just beginning to set, casting an orange glow through the trees. The first night was calm. We roasted marshmallows, shared drinks, and laughed about old memories. Ryan told a ridiculous story about a bear that supposedly stalked him on a camping trip years ago. It was one of those moments where everything felt perfect, where you almost forget the world outside exists. But later that night, as the fire burned low and the others started to doze off, I heard something. It was faint, like a whisper carried on the wind. I sat up, listening intently. At first I thought it was just the sounds of the forest, an owl, maybe, or the rustling of leaves. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight. "Did anyone else hear that?" I asked, but Ryan, Emily, and David were all fast asleep. I scanned the edge of the clearing with my light, but saw nothing. Just shadows dancing between the trees. I shook my head, figuring it was my imagination playing tricks on me. I had stayed up too late and probably just needed some sleep. The next morning, I didn't mention the voice to the others. We had breakfast and spent the day hiking and exploring the surrounding forest. The air was crisp, the sun warm, and the views breathtaking. It was exactly what we had hoped for. But by the time we returned to camp that evening, a sense of unease had crept in. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting between trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. We built another fire and settled in for the night, but the atmosphere was different now. Even Ryan, usually the loudest and most upbeat of us all, seemed quieter. The fire crackled, but the forest beyond felt unnaturally still. No sounds of birds or crickets, just silence. Emily was the first to speak up. "Does it feel different tonight to anyone else? Like something's wrong?" David laughed nervously. "You've been watching too many horror movies." "I'm serious," she insisted. "It feels like we're not alone." Ryan scoffed, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, we're miles from anyone. There's nothing out here but trees." But I knew she was right. I had felt it too, the weight of eyes on us, the cold air pressing in. "I think we should keep the fire going all night," I said, my voice more serious than I intended. Ryan raised an eyebrow. "What, you scared of the dark now?" I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the growing dread. "No, but it doesn't hurt to be cautious." We sat around the fire a little longer, but conversation dwindled. Eventually, Emily and David called it a night and went to their tent. Ryan followed not long after, leaving me alone by the fire. I stared into the flames, the uneasy silence settling in again. And then I heard it. The same voice from the night before, but this time it was clearer, closer. It wasn't the wind, it was something else. The voice was low, almost a growl, and though I couldn't make out the words, it sounded like someone, or something, was calling to me. I stood up, gripping the flashlight tightly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Nothing, just the crackle of the fire and the cold night air. I took a few steps toward the tree line, my heart pounding. The light from the fire barely reached the edge of the clearing, and beyond that, there was only darkness. I heard a branch snap. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the woods. My beam caught something, a shape, tall and shadowy, standing just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out any details, but it was watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, it didn't move. Then, it stepped closer. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I sprinted to Ryan's tent, shaking him awake. "Ryan, wake up. There's something out there." He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "I saw something. Someone, it's watching us." I grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. "We need to go." Ryan mumbled something about me being paranoid, but the fear in my voice must have convinced him because he grabbed his jacket and followed me out of the tent. We stood by the dying fire, scanning the tree line. "Where did you see it?" Ryan asked. But before I could answer, we both heard it, the voice, low, guttural, and unmistakably real. It echoed through the clearing, chilling me to the bone. Ryan's eyes widened. "What the hell?" Without another word, we woke Emily and David. I didn't care if they thought I was crazy. We needed to get out of there. But as we packed up in a frantic rush, the voice came again, louder this time. And it wasn't just a single voice. It was many. Dozens of whispers carried on the wind, swirling around us, growing in volume until it was deafening. Ryan, usually the skeptic, looked terrified. "We need to leave, now." We grabbed our bags, not bothering to fully pack everything, and started toward the trail. But as we reached the edge of the clearing, something stopped us in our tracks. Standing in the middle of the path was the figure I had seen before, now fully visible. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, spindly limbs and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. We all froze, paralyzed with fear. The creature didn't move, but its eyes were fixed on us, unblinking. Emily screamed, and that seemed to break the spell. We turned and ran back toward the camp, but the whispers followed us, growing louder with each step. I glanced back once, just in time to see the creature move. It didn't walk, it glided, its body shifting unnaturally as it pursued us. We reached the campsite, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. "The car," David wheezed. "We need to get to the car." But the car was parked over a mile away, back down the narrow dirt road. There was no way we'd make it in time. The whispers grew louder, and I could feel the creature closing in. We were trapped. Desperation clawed at me as I looked around, searching for something, anything that could help us. My eyes landed on the fire pit. "Ryan, help me!" I shouted, grabbing a burning log from the fire. I thrust it toward the woods, hoping the flames would scare the creature away. To my horror, it didn't flinch. It kept coming, its grin widening as it reached the edge of the clearing. "We're not going to make it," Emily sobbed, backing away. But I wasn't ready to give up. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed another burning log and hurled it toward the creature. This time it recoiled, its glowing eyes narrowing. "It doesn't like fire," Ryan muttered, grabbing a log of his own. "Keep it back." We formed a circle around the fire, brandishing the burning logs like weapons. The creature snarled, but it didn't advance. For now, we were safe. But we couldn't stay here forever. The fire was dying, and the creature wasn't going to leave. "We need to make a run for it," I said, my voice shaking. "While we still can." Ryan nodded grimly. "On 3, 1, 2, 3. We broke into a sprint, racing toward the path that led to the car. The whispers followed us, but I didn't dare look back. My only focus was getting out of those woods alive. As we reached the car and piled inside, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The creature stood at the edge of the trees watching us, its glowing eyes burning into my soul. We sped away, leaving the forest and the demon that hunted campers behind. But I know it's still out there, waiting for its next victims. And I'll never step foot in the woods again. I never believed in the supernatural, ghosts, demons, all that stuff. But if you're hearing this, understand that something out there is not bound by logic. Something so dark, so unnatural, that it doesn't follow any rules we know. My name is Ryan Adams, and this is my story. The story of the black fog that chased me. It was a late summer evening when it all began. I had been on the road for hours, returning from a hiking trip with a few friends in the mountains. We parted ways just outside of town, and I had another 30-minute drive ahead of me to reach my small house on the outskirts. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the trees, and the day still clung to a hint of humidity. The road, usually empty, seemed particularly deserted that night, like something was waiting just beyond the tree line, watching. As I cruised down the lonely stretch of highway, I noticed something strange. A thick, black fog seemed to be creeping across the road ahead of me. At first, I thought it was just smoke from a distant fire, but there was no smell, no ash, just an unnatural blackness swirling like it had a mind of its own. It sat there, unmoving, a few hundred feet ahead. My headlights barely pierced through it. I slowed the car, instinctively. This fog, it wasn't right. There was something off about it, but I had no choice. The road was narrow, bordered by dense woods, and there wasn't enough room to turn around. I had to pass through. As soon as my car entered the fog, everything changed. The world outside seemed to vanish. No trees, no road, not even the sky. Just endless darkness pressing against the windows. The air inside the car grew colder, unnaturally cold for a summer night. My breath started to fog up the glass. I cranked up the heater, but it didn't help. It felt like the cold was coming from inside me, like it was seeping into my bones. Then the sound began. At first, it was faint, a soft whispering that I could barely make out over the hum of the engine. But as I pressed further into the black fog, the whispers grew louder, surrounding me, dozens of voices, no hundreds, speaking all at once. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but it felt like they were speaking to me, calling me, warning me. Panic set in. My foot slammed down on the gas, but the car barely moved. It felt like I was driving through mud, like something was holding the car back, trying to stop me. The whispers became shouts, angry, desperate. I gripped the wheel, white-knuckled, fighting the urge to scream myself. And then I saw it, in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog. A shadow, maybe, or my mind playing tricks on me. But no, it was real. A dark shape, humanoid but wrong, emerged from the blackness behind me, walking slowly, deliberately toward my car. Its form was indistinct, like it was made of the same swirling fog that surrounded me, but its eyes, oh God, its eyes. Two burning red orbs that pierced through the darkness, locked on me. I slammed the pedal to the floor again, but the car still crawled forward. The shadow was getting closer. I could see it more clearly now. A tall figure, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its movements unnatural, jerky, like it didn't belong in this world. And those eyes, they never left me. The voices outside turned to screams, overlapping in a cacophony of madness, urging me to run, to escape. But I couldn't. The black fog surrounded me, trapping me in this nightmare. Suddenly my headlights caught something up ahead, a break in the fog, a way out. My heart leapt in my chest, and I forced the car to move faster, the engine roaring in protest. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it. The shadow. It was right behind me, its presence pressing down on me like a weight, suffocating. Just when I thought it was over, that the fog would consume me, I burst through into the clear night air. The blackness vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving me gasping for breath. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I sped down the road, heart pounding, until the lights of my small town came into view. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. I told myself it had been a hallucination, stress from the long drive. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had followed me, something from that black fog. I stayed inside as much as possible, locking my doors at night, drawing the curtains. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, that constant gnawing sense that it was still out there, waiting. A week later, it happened again. I was driving home from work, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon. As I turned onto the road leading to my house, I saw it. The fog. It was there, sitting in the distance, just like before. Thick, black, impenetrable. I pulled the car over, my heart racing. This time I wasn't going to drive into it. I wasn't going to let it trap me again. But as I sat there, staring at the fog, I realized something. It was moving. Slowly, steadily, the fog crept toward me, swallowing the road, the trees, the sky. I threw the car into reverse, but before I could move, the fog was all around me again. The cold returned. The whispers started up, louder this time, more insistent. And then, in my rearview mirror, I saw it. The figure. It was back. Panic gripped me as the shadow approached, faster this time, its long limbs reaching out toward the car. The red eyes glowed brighter, and I could hear it now. Not just the whispers, but its breathing. Heavy, ragged breaths, as if it was tired from chasing me. I slammed the car into drive and sped forward, the engine screaming in protest. The fog was thicker than before, suffocating, but I pushed through. The figure was right behind me, so close I could almost feel its hand on my shoulder. Just when I thought it would catch me, I burst through the fog again, into the clear night. The road stretched out before me, empty, but I didn't stop. I kept driving until I reached the center of town, heart hammering in my chest. I knew then that it wasn't over. The fog wasn't just some strange weather phenomenon. It was alive. It wanted me. I haven't been back to that road since. I moved out of town, far away, hoping to outrun whatever was chasing me. But sometimes, late at night, I see it in my dreams. The black fog creeping closer, and that shadowy figure, watching, waiting. And I know, deep down, that one day I won't be able to escape it. One day, the black fog will catch me. And when it does, I'll disappear into it just like the others. Just like the voices I heard calling out for help. If you ever see that fog, turn around. Don't drive through it. Don't stop. Just run. Because once it finds you, it never lets go. It's still out there, waiting. And one day, it will come for you too. People often romanticize trains. There's something timeless about the way they carve through landscapes, connecting the living world like veins pumping life through the body. But after what I've experienced, I'll never look at a train the same way again. My name is Samuel Clark, and this is the story of the ghostly train that never arrives. It started with a trip. I had taken the train out of necessity, not by choice. My car had broken down, and I was on my way to visit my sister in a small town a few hundred miles away. It wasn't a big deal. I'd taken this route many times. The train station was old, sure, but it had its charm, with wooden benches and vintage signs that made you feel like you were stepping back in time. There were only a few other passengers that night, a couple, a businessman, and a young woman with a large suitcase. It was late, and the station was eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that gets under your skin and makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. The hum of the lights, the distant screech of an animal, the soft shuffle of feet across the worn wooden floor. I checked my watch. The train should have arrived 10 minutes ago, but there was no sign of it. No announcement, no distant whistle. Just silence. I stood up and walked over to the ticket booth, where an old man sat behind the glass. He looked like he had been there for decades, with graying hair and a weary look in his eyes. "Excuse me," I said. "Do you know when the next train is supposed to arrive? It's running late." The old man looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he wasn't quite sure what I was talking about. Then, in a slow, gravelly voice, he said, "The 11:45 hasn't run on time in years." I blinked, confused. "But it's still coming, right?" He didn't answer. Instead, he just stared at me for a long moment before leaning back in his chair and muttering, "It'll come when it's ready." Feeling unsettled, I returned to my seat. The couple near me seemed oblivious, lost in their own conversation. The businessman was tapping away at his laptop, and the young woman had her headphones in, her eyes closed, as if she was trying to block out the world. I tried to do the same, focusing on my phone, scrolling mindlessly through news headlines, but I couldn't shake the strange vibe hanging in the air. It was nearly midnight when things took a turn. There was a low rumble, so faint at first that I thought I had imagined it, but then it grew louder, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. The lights in the station flickered, and a chill swept through the air. The young woman across from me pulled out her headphones and looked around, her expression confused and anxious. The businessman stopped typing, his fingers frozen mid-air above his keyboard. Everyone was on edge, like we were all waiting for something bad. And then we heard it, the distant sound of a train whistle. Relief washed over me. Finally, the train was coming. But as the whistle drew nearer, something about it seemed off. It wasn't the normal sharp blast of a modern train. No, this whistle was deeper, older, like something out of a forgotten era. The rumbling grew louder, and I stood up, peering down the tracks. There it was, emerging from the darkness. A train, but not the one I was expecting. Instead of the sleek modern carriages I had ridden dozens of times before, this train looked ancient. The cars were weathered and worn, their black paint peeling and rusting, and the windows were covered in a thick layer of grime. There were no lights inside, no passengers visible through the glass. As the train pulled into the station, the air grew colder still. My breath came out in misty puffs, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Something wasn't right. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, to get away from that train. But I didn't move. None of us did. We were all frozen, transfixed by the sight of it. The train came to a stop, its brakes screeching loudly in the silence of the night. The doors slid open with a creak, but no one stepped out. There was only darkness beyond the threshold, an impenetrable blackness that seemed to swallow the light around it. The couple next to me stood up first, moving toward the train as if in a trance. They didn't speak, didn't even glance at each other as they walked hand in hand toward the open door. I wanted to stop them, to tell them not to get on, but my voice wouldn't work. My body wouldn't move. The businessman was next. He closed his laptop, stood, and walked silently toward the train, his eyes glazed over, as if he wasn't really seeing anything. He boarded without hesitation, disappearing into the dark. The young woman stood up last, clutching her suitcase. She looked at me, her eyes wide and terrified. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't have an answer for her. I didn't know what was happening. All I knew was that we needed to get out of there, and fast. But before I could say anything, the old man in the ticket booth spoke up again. "You get on that train, son, and you ain't ever getting off." The woman and I both turned to look at him. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, as if he had seen this all before. "That's not a train for the living," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "It's for the lost." A chill ran down my spine, and I felt my legs start to move, my feet carrying me backward, away from the train. But the young woman wasn't so lucky. She was still standing near the edge of the platform when someone reached out from the darkness inside the train. A hand, pale and bony, grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the open door. She screamed, dropping her suitcase and trying to wrench herself free, but the hand was too strong. In a heartbeat, she was dragged inside, her scream echoing through the empty station. The doors slammed shut with a deafening clang, and the train began to move, slowly at first, then faster, speeding down the tracks and disappearing into the night. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. The station was silent again, the cold air lifting as if nothing had happened. But something happened. That train, that thing, wasn't supposed to be here. It wasn't from this world. I ran to the ticket booth, desperate for answers. What the hell just happened? I shouted at the old man, my voice shaking with fear and anger. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with sadness. That train hasn't been on any schedule for over 50 years, he said quietly. But sometimes it still shows up, for those who are lost. And once it takes you, there's no coming back. I stared at him, not understanding. What do you mean, who are the lost? The old man sighed, leaning back in his chair. People who don't belong anymore. People who are already half gone. That couple you saw? They've been dead for years, buried together in the cemetery up the road. The businessman? No one's seen him in this town since he disappeared on this very platform a decade ago. My mind reeled, struggling to process what he was saying. And the woman? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He shook his head. I don't know. Maybe she was already halfway there. Maybe that train just found her at the wrong time. I couldn't believe it. This couldn't be real. It didn't make any sense. But then I remembered the way the couple had moved, the glazed look in the businessman's eyes, the cold, unnatural air that surrounded the train. It wasn't real, at least not in any way I could understand. I didn't stay at the station after that. I couldn't. I ran back to town, not stopping until I was inside my sister's house, locking the door behind me and gasping for breath. I told her everything, but she didn't believe me. Who would? It sounded insane. But I know what I saw, I know what happened. It's been years now, but I still think about that night. I still wonder what happened to that young woman, to the others who got on that train. Are they out there somewhere, trapped in that endless darkness? Are they lost forever? Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear it again. The faint sound of a train whistle in the distance. I'll look out my window, but there's never anything there. Just the sound of something approaching, something that never truly arrives. But I know it's coming, and when it does, I'll be ready. Or at least I hope I will. Because once that train finds you, there's no escaping it. I never believed in monsters until I moved into the house next door to one. It was a small, unassuming place on the corner of Willow Street. The kind of house you walk past without even noticing, with its peeling paint and broken shutters. I had just gotten out of a messy breakup and needed a fresh start. The rent was cheap, the neighborhood was quiet, and it seemed like the perfect place to disappear for a while. At first, nothing seemed strange about the house next door. It looked abandoned, honestly. The grass was overgrown and the windows were so filthy that you couldn't see inside. But every night, just after sunset, I noticed a light flickering on in the second floor window. It was subtle, more like a candle than an electric bulb, but it was enough to pique my curiosity. I never saw anyone come or go from that house, and during the day it was completely silent. At night, though, I started hearing noises. Faint at first, whispers, or maybe the sound of furniture moving. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, or the house settling, but it didn't take long before the noises became something I couldn't ignore. One night, I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps walking up and down the stairs in the house next door. I had never seen anyone enter or leave that place, yet here was someone walking inside, just after dark. That's when I decided to take a closer look. I waited until the following night. After the light flickered on in the upstairs window, I grabbed a flashlight and snuck around the side of the house. The front door was locked as I expected, but the side gate leading to the backyard creaked open with barely a push. The backyard was just as unkempt as the front, with wild vines crawling up the sides of the house and dead leaves scattered everywhere. I walked up to one of the windows, peering inside. That's when I saw him. A tall, gaunt figure stood in the middle of what appeared to be a dining room. His back was to me, but even from where I stood, I could tell something was off. His skin was too pale, almost gray, and he moved with an eerie stillness. He didn't seem to notice me watching. His attention was focused on something in front of him. a large, old-fashioned mirror that took up most of the wall. Suddenly he turned. I dropped to the ground, my heart hammering in my chest. Had he seen me? I lay there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through the window again, the room was empty. He was gone. The next morning, I told myself I must have imagined the whole thing. I was stressed, lonely, maybe even a little paranoid. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. I knew something was wrong with the man in that house. A few days later, I met Mrs. Turner, the elderly woman who lived across the street. We exchanged pleasantries, and I casually asked about the house next door. "Oh, that place?" she said, lowering her voice. "It's been empty for years. Used to belong to the Moreau family. Tragic story, really. They all disappeared one night. Poof, just like that. Nobody knows what happened to them." "Disappeared?" I asked, my curiosity growing. Mrs. Turner nodded solemnly. "Strangest thing. No bodies, no signs of a struggle. Just gone. People say that house is cursed, that whoever lives there is doomed to suffer the same fate." I tried to laugh it off, but her words stuck with me. That night, the footsteps returned. Louder this time. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something heavy moving through the house. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, as the sound of those steps echoed in my ears. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening next door. The following night, I grabbed my flashlight and my phone, planning to record whatever I found. I snuck back to the house, creeping around to the side gate as before. This time, though, the back door was slightly ajar. My breath caught in my throat, but I forced myself to step inside. The air was thick, stale, and there was a faint, metallic smell I couldn't quite place. I was in what appeared to be the kitchen. Dust covered every surface, and the air was so cold I could see my breath. The house felt like it hadn't been lived in for years, and yet there were fresh footprints in the dust on the floor. I followed the footprints into the hallway, past the dining room where I had seen the man the other night. The mirror was still there, old and cracked, but it was what lay in front of it that stopped me dead in my tracks. A coffin. An honest-to-God coffin right there in the middle of the room. My heart pounded in my chest as I edged closer. The lid was open, and it was empty. Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard it. A low, guttural hiss coming from behind me. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand. He was standing there, the man, or whatever he was, from the window. His eyes were black, hollow, and his lips were drawn back in a snarl, revealing long, sharp fangs. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor. He took a step toward me, his movements unnaturally fluid, like a predator stalking its prey. I stumbled backward, crashing into the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and terrified. But something was wrong. He wasn't in the reflection. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I bolted for the door, my flashlight slipping from my grasp as I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my own house, every door locked, every window bolted shut. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room, watching the house next door through the curtains, waiting for the first light of dawn. But the house remained dark, lifeless. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. Who would believe me? A vampire living next door. It sounded insane. But I knew the truth, and I knew I wasn't safe. A few days later, I woke up to a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Turner, holding a pie in her hands, smiling warmly. "Thought you might like some company," she said. "I know living alone can be hard sometimes." I invited her in, grateful for the distraction. As we sat in the kitchen, she glanced out the window at the house next door. "You know," she said quietly, "there's a rumor that the Moreau family wasn't the first to disappear from that house." I froze. "What do you mean?" She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "They say that house has been cursed for centuries. that something evil lives there, feeding on whoever's unfortunate enough to move in next door. I stared at her, my heart racing. You knew? Mrs. Turner smiled, a cold, knowing smile that sent a chill down my spine. Oh, I've known for a long time. I just wanted to see how long it would take you to figure it out. I didn't understand. I felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over me, my vision blurring. The room spun, and I slumped forward, barely conscious. Through the haze, I heard her voice, calm and patient. You see, dear, the thing about vampires is, they're never alone. As darkness closed in, I saw her reflection in the window. She wasn't there either. I never moved out of that house, because now I'm just like them. And if you're reading this, you've already come too close.